All right, welcome everyone to the newest session of KALAM Contemporary Debates. I am your moderator today, and my name is Shoaib Ahmed Malik. I've been on this show before, sometimes as a moderator, sometimes as a speaker. But today I'll be moderating, we have two speakers today. We have, on the one hand, Dr. Jeffrey Koperski. He's the Christmas Santa Claus looking guy that you see in the in the Zoom video. And just to quickly introduce him, I've known Jeff, I think now for the past couple of years. We were on a project together, and one of the most amazing minds in philosophy of science. So he used to be an engineer, couldn't make it through in that career, so he went into philosophy of science. Jokes aside, he's a very established author. He's published with several well-known journals. These include Zygon, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Journal of Philosophy of Science, and even the British Journal for Philosophy of Science. So, and he's also got two fantastic books out there: Physics of Theism, which was published with Wiley Blackwell, and this book right here, which I really enjoyed. I enjoyed both of his works, but this is his second book, which is available for open access, so you can actually download that for free. This one's called Divine Action, Determinism, and the Laws of Nature, and this one is published with Routledge. And this ties into what the topic of our session today is going to be about: the laws of nature. Jeff has several things to say on the subject matter, so we're looking forward to seeing what he has to speak about today. Maybe he can share some things that illuminate our minds, and hopefully we can have a fantastic conversation forwards. The commentator is none other than the Turkish legend hailing from Macedonia. It's Enis Doko, right? He's the guy with the two glasses hiding behind his face right there, the hijab, he's hiding behind there. So Enis is, a very well-known person across the Balkans. And, he's published several books on the subject matter in science and religion, speaks several languages, a prodigy child in the making. Isaac Newton would definitely be afraid of Enis if he were alive today. So these are the two giants that we have for today's conversation. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, but before I do, just some house rules. Please do keep your microphones off. We want to make sure that everything is as slick and smooth as possible. If you have any questions, reserve them until we have the Q&A session. The first 40 minutes will be Jeff's segment. We'll then have a 5-minute break. Then Enis will hop on board, speak for a couple of minutes, and then we'll let it rip for the Q&A part. So please do, keep the questions, written down somewhere, and then share them in the chat box whenever we get into the Q&A. Apart from that, I've got nothing else to say. Jeff, the seat is yours.
Okay, so we will. I hope you can see the video, so I'm starting it now.
Okay, well, you probably know who I am, so I'm going to get started here. I should tell you, just to make sure, that I'm a philosopher of science. It's my area of specialization. I've been teaching about 25 years now. And one of the topics that comes up a lot in my courses is the laws of nature. Okay, it comes up in the history of philosophy and the history of science. It comes up in the philosophy of religion, especially if we're talking about divine action and miracles and stuff like that. And it comes up in the philosophy of science. It comes up in my area because there's no agreement about what the laws of nature are. And when I say that, I'm not saying that there's some sort of scientific dispute about what equations should go in the textbooks and stuff like that. I'm talking about the ontology of laws. Okay, so what is a law of nature? Okay, if again in philosophy of religion, if we're talking about miracles, if God breaks a law of nature, what exactly is being broken? What is a law? What's the ontology? See, that's something that scientists, they don't talk about. And that's because you can use the laws of nature without knowing precisely what they are. But philosophers, we can't leave it at that. So we ask bigger questions. So today I want to talk about the three main ways that philosophers of science typically talk about the laws of nature. I'll be curious in the Q&A which of these you think is most attractive. I'll spend some time at the end giving you my own view where I come down on all this. Okay. All right. So let's start with some history. The first thing you need to know is that ancient and medieval thinkers did not believe in laws of nature. Now, How can that be? Because you know that the ancients, they knew about the changing seasons, they invented astronomy. So they knew that nature was regular and consistent. So how can I say that they didn't believe in the laws of nature? Well, see, this is a different question. Well, the question here is not whether nature is regular. Yeah, they knew that. The question is what's responsible for that regularity. And my claim is that the ancients did not think that regularity was due to laws. So in their view, people make laws. So the idea of laws, that belongs to the realm of politics and government. That's not about nature. So what is responsible for the regularities in nature? What did they think? Well, they had a number of answers, but one of the best probably goes back to Aristotle. And Aristotle believed that every substance, mostly anything that you could find out there in nature, is a combination of essence and matter, two things together. So essences, they provide structure to reality. So rocks always fall, fire always rises, all triangles have three sides, all horses are mammals. Why? Why these regularities? Because each substance has an essence that makes it that sort of thing and then gives it its capacities to act. So this was the metaphysical system that was developed by Thomas Aquinas and others in the 13th century. So all that changed in the West during the scientific revolution. And the first big change was this rejection of Aristotelian metaphysics. And there were two main reasons for this. So first, essences, the notion of essences just became seen as just scientifically useless. So the chemist Robert Boyle said that it isn't even clear what we're talking about when we're talking about essences. Isaac Newton called them occult entities, and all that meant was that they're just unobservable, which tends to go against the spirit of empirical science. Another reason, this isn't the only other reason, but another reason was theological. So if Aristotelian essences are responsible for the order in nature, they're kind of running things, then they're running things, not God. It seems like they're governing nature rather than God. And so does God actually need these sort of intermediaries between God and nature to govern? And a lot of Newton's colleagues at Cambridge thought no, that God doesn't need anything else. So Isaac Barrow, who occupied the same endowed chair as Newton, said, God uses no other means, instruments, or applications in these productions than his bare word or command. I'll say more about that here in a little while. Okay. All right, so this rejection then of Aristotelianism, it was also important for experimental science because the medievals didn't believe in doing experiments, and there was a reason for that. Because if you want to discover the essence of a thing, then the idea was you have to let it behave naturally. Just let it do what it does. Don't interfere with it. So, let rocks fall and just see what happens. That's natural motion. If you push a rock up a plane, that's unnatural motion. That's against its nature. It's not what the rock wants to do. The idea was most experiments are producing unnatural motion. They're putting objects in strange situations and forcing them to behave in unnatural ways. So from an Aristotelian point of view, that was just useless. You couldn't learn anything from that. You couldn't learn anything from experiments. Once you had the shift then away from this Aristotelian idea with essences and into the laws of nature, so all that changed. Scientists, they started doing experiments, and empirical science really just takes off all at that same time. There's a theological issue here too. Most medieval theologians in the West believe that God also has an essence. And then that essence, God's essence, restricts his choices to some degree. So like if God is all good, if he's omnibenevolent, he can't do anything that's intrinsically evil. He's constrained. In the same way, an all-wise God can only act in a perfectly rational way. A minority view was known as voluntarism. And the voluntarists rejected this. The voluntarists believe that God is completely free. He can do whatever he wants. So, in fact, God chooses to be good and merciful to us, but it's a choice. Nothing constrains God. Nothing makes him behave that way. And so, that's an interesting debate that happened a few hundred years before Newton. The reason I'm bringing it up here is voluntarism reemerges in the 17th century, and now it reemerges with respect to the laws of nature. Okay, so whatever the laws are, the idea was that they didn't have to be that way. God had lots of choices. He had lots of options to choose from, and his choice was kind of arbitrary. It wasn't something that he had to do because of his perfect rationality. It wasn't determined by his perfect goodness. There's just like a lot of choices. There's about what the laws could be. They're all equally good, and God just simply chose, just by fiat. Now, that presents then for us an epistemic problem, right? So how are we going to figure out what choices God made when it comes to the laws of nature? Because it's not like you could use theological principles to kind of infer what the laws are. And then God hasn't revealed them to us. So like, what are we going to do? How do we figure this out? And the answer that a lot of early moderns gave was, again, observations and experiments. So we can't discover what the laws are by means of pure reason, by sitting back and thinking really hard about it. But God has given us the ability to go out, make observations, and figure out what the laws are. So yeah, we can discover what the laws are, but we've got to do the work. We got to go out and see. So the point here is that empiricism itself had a theological motivation. And God has ordained the laws of nature, but he hasn't told us which laws he has chosen, and the only way for us to find out is to go do the work, do the experiments, do the observations. It's up to us. So the point here is that empiricism itself is rooted in this change away from essences and into laws. Okay, so this part of the story ends in the 1700s. Almost everyone at this time believed, yep, there are laws of nature. They are ordained by God, and most believe that laws just are like God's decrees. God just speaks, and the laws, are. They aren't powers. Like God didn't create laws of nature. They're not out there. It's just God saying how things are going to go, and that's how they go. All right. So one question you might ask, perfectly good historical question, is, well, what happened? Right? I mean, because that is not the way we talk about laws today. Now it's a completely secular, naturalistic idea, or at least that's what we're told. And it might never have occurred to you that the laws of nature have anything to do with God. So how do we get from there, right, where the laws of this intrinsically theistic idea to today? Well, I think that's a pretty good question. I do not think it has been adequately explored by historians of science, but that's kind of another topic. I don't have time for that now. Instead, what I want to do is move from the history part of the lecture and get into how things stand today, a little bit more contemporary. So what I want to do is talk about the different approaches to the laws of nature in the philosophical literature. Eventually, at the end, I'm going to try to defend a particular position. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that I think Newton and Barrow and Boyle, and their contemporaries, I think they were pretty much right. I think they were really close to the correct answer. But again, that's jumping ahead. So we will get there in due time. All right, so three main approaches to understanding the laws in the philosophy of science literature. So I'm going to introduce them really fast, and then I'll go back and give you more details as we go. All right, so the first view is the reduction of laws down to mere regularities between events. So the idea is that we observe a lot of regularities out there. We observe the perfectly regular orbits of the planets, say, and then from the data, we summarize them in something we would call, say, Kepler's laws. So on this view, these are called Humean laws after the philosopher David Hume. And they're just summaries. They're just summaries of the data, summaries of the things that we see. So this is a very minimalist view of the laws. The second view is held by those who believe that there are things out there that control events, that kind of govern reality. But the second camp doesn't believe it's the laws. The laws aren't the things that are responsible for the regularities in nature. It's something internal to things themselves. So these internal things are often called dispositions, sometimes causal power, sometimes capacities, but it's inside every entity. And finally, the third view is the one most like the early modern philosophers. And this last view, we're going to call them nomological realists. I'll explain why. They take laws to be a fundamental category within metaphysics. Okay, so these are all broad families. There's a lot of diversity within each of these three, but I hope to give you like just enough detail so that you can kind of understand their overall strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so let's start with the Humean view. A couple different types of Humean views. And somewhere here, I think most philosophers of science, this is where most of us fall. I think it's because many of us don't like metaphysics. I do, okay, but I'm an exception. So Humeans believe in occurrent events. So things happen, out there in the world, like when a system evolves from one state to another. What they reject is any idea that the laws of nature govern reality. It's because there's nothing that governs reality, according to the Humean. There's no sense in which nature or events just have to behave one way rather than another, says the Humean. So the older Humean view, maybe the original Humean view, is what we would call regularity theory. So according to regularity theory, the laws just are descriptions of perfectly regular events. So water freezes when the temperature is below 0 degrees Celsius. Air flows from high pressure areas to low pressure areas. Salt dissolves in water, right? One thing happens in another, but nothing makes it happen. Nothing makes one event follow another. So salt doesn't have to dissolve in water. It just does. It just happens to do so. So Hume himself said that any feelings of like have to, like one thing has to follow another, any sense of deep causation here, that's just a psychological projection on our part. So we see this regular concomitance of events, this regularity in nature, and then psychologically we project or impose causation, this notion that they're somehow tied together. We impose that on nature. But Hume said that's not real. Okay, causation itself, that's really a projection in us. It's all psychological. All there are just events. There's just stuff that happens out there. Okay, so this is a metaphysically very simple view. There are no Aristotelian essences. There are no laws of nature out there kind of running the show. There's just things that behave in regular ways. That's it. And the Humean will say that's all science needs, right? Scientists don't care about metaphysics. They just discover these regularities, and some of them they call laws of nature. End of story. That's it. All right, well, there are several well-known problems for this type of Humeanism. And one is trying to figure out which of the regularities out there should count as laws. So like all metals conduct electricity, that seems like a law. All American presidents are men, that doesn't seem like a law, okay? But the problem is both of those have the same logical structure in terms of their syntax. They are the same. So what makes one of them a law and the other one not? Just why is the other one what we would call an accidental generalization? Well, you might think, well, it's just trivial, right? We should be able to figure that out. Turns out it is really hard. Okay, this is something that the philosophers tried to hammer out for decades, and for the most part, they've just given up. There just is no simple answer that collects all the right regularities over in the one bucket we call laws and puts all the non-laws over in a different bucket. It's really hard to come up with a criteria for when that happens. Another problem is that the regularity theory doesn't seem to describe how scientists actually use laws, at least some scientists. I mean, you think of cosmologists, they have no problem talking about, say, a theoretical universe that has no particles in it, okay, or a universe that collapses back on itself. And the reason they're able to do that is because they know how the laws of nature would apply in those other circumstances. But if you're a regularity theorist, so you can't do that. You can't say how our laws apply in other universes, because the regularities in those universes, they would be different, right? And if the regularities are different in those other universes, then the laws are different. So if that's right, cosmologists shouldn't be able to say anything about possible universes, what's happening in other possible universes, because our laws don't apply in those universes. So my point just is that, look, I think what physicists are doing is fine. It's just that they assume that our laws transcend events. nature is regular because there are laws, which means that the laws can't just be reduced to the events themselves. Okay? So, given these problems and some others, okay, I'm kind of giving you the highlights here. Humeans have turned elsewhere, and most of them have just given up on the regularity theory. Okay? So the second more popular view, the best systems view, this says that we should start with this idea. We had a complete index of all scientific truths. Now, we never will, but just say we did, okay? Now, say we organize these truths into a deductive system, kind of like Euclidean geometry, where you have general axioms, and those axioms allow us to derive then truths about more special cases. So on this approach, this best systems approach, those axioms, if we tried to generate axioms from this complete list of scientific truths, the axioms, well, that's what the laws of nature are. They just are these axioms in this overall system. They're general truths that entail more specific facts about nature. Now, look, I realize this whole thing is kind of an idealization, but the idea is that what the laws we have in the textbooks today, the idea is, well, they're probably pretty close to what these axioms would be if we had all the truths. Maybe they're not exactly right, but they're pretty close. So that kind of justifies our current scientific practice. So that's it, the laws. They would be the axioms in this overall deductive system. Now, if some of you feel dissatisfied with that, but you're not sure why, it's like, that just doesn't seem what I mean when I'm talking about laws of nature. I get it. Okay, look, the Humean will just say, look, you wanted an account of laws. Well, here it is. This tells you what the laws are. The reason you're dissatisfied is this, because there's an important ambiguity in this phrase, law of nature, and not everyone explains this ambiguity. Okay, so what we need to distinguish are laws and law statements. So a law statement, that's what you find in, say, a physics classroom. That would be something someone could write up on a whiteboard, something like the ideal gas law. So the laws themselves, though, not law statements, if there are any laws of nature, we tend to think of those as being out there, right? They're like out there in reality. Scientists are trying to discover the laws of nature. So laws themselves, they can't be wrong. They're out there or they're not. Law statements, the things we have in our textbooks, those could be wrong, right? And if they're true, it's because a law of nature makes them true. So gravity has been at work, way before the Earth even existed. But Newton's equation that describes gravity, that's only been around a few hundred years. That equation, that's a law statement. That's not itself the law. So if you understand that, if you get the notion of law statements, something you could write down, laws of nature out there kind of running the show, then and one easy way to understand the Humean view of laws is this. There are no laws of nature. The only things there are law statements. That's it. Okay? So those axioms, again, in that best systems approach, those are law statements. Okay? If you're dissatisfied with this view, if you think there's got to be more to it, it's because intuitively you probably think, no, there are also not just law statements, there are laws of nature out there, right? There's something more. Now, the Humean would say, look, you just got to get over that. Right? It's like, no, there's nothing more. Non-Humeans, okay, they think, well, no, the Humean only has half the issue here, has half the answer. Because what we really want to know is why? Why does nature have these regularities? Why don't electrons ever attract each other? Why does gravity work the same way here as it does in other galaxies? Why is nature so regular and uniform, at least a lot of the time? And again, the Humean would just say, it's a bad question. It's a metaphysical question. Don't ask that. But if you think those are perfectly good questions and that they deserve an answer, then you're going to need a different account of laws. You're going to need something else. And the non-Humeans, yeah, we agree, right? These are good questions. They deserve an answer. When a law statement is true, there's something that makes them true, something that keeps nature running on its course. Okay? So, but if you think that's where your intuitions are, then you can't be a Humean. You got to do something else. So let's turn to the second account. The second view says there is something that keeps nature uniform, running on course, but the second view denies that it's laws of nature. It's not laws that keep everything running on course. It's causal powers or dispositions within each thing. So just take something like salt, okay? Salt molecules have several dispositions. So they have the disposition to dissolve in water. They have the disposition to attract other bits of matter out there by way of gravitation, and lots more. They've got everything's got all sorts of dispositions. Okay? And so again, it's something in every entity. Now, for those of you who know something about the history of philosophy, even just what I've said earlier, it might sound like dispositions are a lot like Aristotelian essences. And if so, you're right. Dispositionalism is kind of the philosophical descendant of those Aristotelian essences. Aristotelianism would be a type of dispositionalism today. Okay, so dispositions in this view, they are active powers out there in nature, and they ensure that everything behaves according to those dispositions. So while a Humean can't guarantee that, say, electrons will never start attracting each other, a dispositionalist can, right? Dispositionalist says, look, causal powers, dispositions, they don't change. They can't change. So not only do electrons not attract each other, they can't. They cannot do so. Their disposition to repel, that cannot change. So if you think there's more to the laws of nature than just Humean law statements, then this is a step in the right direction. It's not the right step, in my view. I think there's a better way to go. But this is, I should say, it's a very popular view among metaphysicians, among philosophers of religion. It's a somewhat less popular view among philosophers of science, and here are a couple of reasons why. So one is just the history of science that I've already talked about. Dispositionalism kind of represents a return to something more like Aristotelianism, right? It's a more Aristotelian framework. But, isn't that a little odd? Doesn't that seem strange? The Aristotelian version of dispositionalism, that actually hindered the development of science. That seems pretty universally agreed upon. And as I said, Aristotelianism, it was replaced by a more law-centric view. We pushed all that aside and went to the notion of laws. And once we got to laws, that opened up empiricism, experimentalism. It's kind of a big deal, right? So here's my question. If dispositionalism were right all along, why did natural philosophers have to get rid of it, right? Why did we have to push it to the side in order to make so much progress in science? A modern day dispositionalist will say, well, they never disproved dispositionalism, and I guess that's true, but that's not exactly a reason to believe it. You understand what I'm saying? So that's one thing. I think the history tends to mitigate against dispositionalism. But the main worry, at least among philosophers of physics that I know, they worry that causal powers, dispositions, it's like, what are they exactly? I mean, it's really the same complaint that Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton had. It's just like, what are we talking about? What exactly is that? And it seems like it's kind of a step backwards in terms of our overall understanding. Because, in terms of laws, we know about force laws, laws of dynamics, conservation laws, right? There's lots of different types of laws. Why would we want to retreat to this much less precise notion of dispositions and causal powers? It seems really fuzzy compared to laws, which we know a lot about. I think most philosophers, people who like this view, they just think it's kind of more intuitive, okay? But in my view, so what? I'd rather have the precision of laws, which is why most philosophers of physics, I think, they don't like this dispositionalist view. All right, so as I said before, we got three views. All right, there are Humean laws, which again really just are about law statements. The Humean doesn't believe there are laws of nature kind of running things. The dispositionalist does believe in something more. Something is running the show, but it's not the laws, right? They don't believe in laws. The third family here, this last one, this is the one that takes laws seriously. This is the one I called before nomological realism. Okay, so the root here, nomos, is Greek. That's the Greek root for law. And then realism just means that in some sense or other, the laws are real. They're out there. Okay, so they have some sort of standing, independent standing. They're fundamental. The laws on this view are what the law statements, that's what they're trying to describe. We're trying to describe the true laws of nature. If there is a true law statement, it's because there's a law that makes it true. And I think this is what most people have in mind when they hear the phrase law of nature. But you can tell me, my intuitions might be shot on this. Okay, so the laws are real, but what are they? What's the ontology? So we have a few options here. You won't like the first one, I'm betting, but this is the one that most philosophers are familiar with, so let me run through it kind of quickly. Let's start with a law statement. All metals conduct electricity. Okay, that's true. What makes it true? Well, on this first view, the term metal and conductor, those refer to something. They refer to universals or properties. So when one property necessitates another, which just means that when one property occurs, the other one has to occur, then there's a law of nature at work. When you've got this necessitation between the two universals, there's a law. If a thing is a metal, then it has to be a conductor. So the law then here is just a particular relation between the properties. Now, that might seem kind of trivial to you, but there's an awful lot that's packed into this notion of universal. That's a big philosophical word. Universals aren't just sets. Okay, so like all of my students, that would refer to a set, not a universal, just a group of things. Universals aren't individuals, so you're not a universal. My car isn't a universal. Universals are properties that can be in more than one place at one time. So my coffee mug at home is red. The pen I use for grading, it's red. So redness, that shows up in more than one place at one time. It's what philosophers call an abstract object. And some people believe that when universals are related in the right way, then you get a law of nature. Okay. Now, if you're a more empirically minded person, your eyes are probably glazing over a little bit at this point. It just kind of seems kind of abstract, kind of philosophical. I get that completely. Okay. If you have a science background, this might not seem to connect very well with your intuitions about what a law is. I get that too, right? I mean, you know what a conductor is, you know what a metal is, but what are these abstract objects? How do we have any epistemic access to those? Those are great questions. Okay. I'm not going to try to answer those because I don't think there are great answers to those questions. So let's just try something else. Let me just move on to another. Let me go on to Tim Maudlin's view, primitivism about laws. So Maudlin's a philosopher of physics, and he just says, well, look, this notion of laws, it's so important. It's so useful. We should just take it as fundamental, as basic. We should just accept that there are laws of nature and then forget about, just don't even try to give any sort of analysis to it. Right? Just take it kind of part of the basic building blocks, one of the basic building blocks of our overall conceptual scheme. There just are laws of nature. Now, you might feel like that's cheating, okay? Because, you just kind of build it in, and refuse to talk about it anymore. Well, I understand, but look, everybody's got to start somewhere. Okay, at some fundamental level, you have assumptions about what reality is like. So look, you probably believe that causes always happen before their effects. You probably believe you're not the only conscious person, on the planet. The thing is, you can't prove either of those. Right? You just kind of have to assume that they're true. There's just no getting around that there are some things we all believe that you can't have proof for. You can't demonstrate. You just have to accept them. You have to start somewhere. So Maudlin thinks this is just one of those places where we should start. The idea of the laws of nature, it's fundamental. Now again, if you think that's cheating, I do understand. But here's what I like about it. Okay, first of all, I agree that the idea of laws of nature, it's really important. Okay, really useful. That's one reason I'm not a dispositionalist, because again, they think there are dispositions and there's not laws. So I kind of side with the Humean here, that I think laws are really important, but I think the Humean notion of laws, that's just too weak. Okay, so like all nomological realists, I think there are laws of nature out there rather than just law statements. But I don't think we have to go Maudlin's route. I don't think we have to take them as basic. I think we can say more. Okay, so let's start with a slightly different question. All right, so where did this notion of laws of nature come from? Where did it come from in the first place? And if you've been paying attention, then you might have noticed something here. When I talk about the move away from Aristotelianism in the 17th century, theism played a really important role. So let me remind you what I said. The leading thinkers at the time, all the names that you know from the scientific revolution, they were theists. They didn't like Aristotelianism, they didn't like Aristotelian essences, and they didn't think that God needed them. So most thought that the laws of nature, again, they're just patterns within God's will for how nature will behave. Now, of course, that's a very different notion. That's a very different way of thinking about the laws than today. And today, when we teach science or the history of science, we don't talk about God, right? In fact, we often treat the notion of laws and God as like they're competing explanations. Like once we've explained something in terms of the laws of nature, we don't even need God anymore, right? God just gets pushed out. You know, the early modern thinkers, the ones who came up with the notion to begin with, they just would have been just completely confused by that, right? They would have said, look, you can't have laws for the whole of nature without God, right? The two things go together. So the idea that there's some sort of conflict between laws and theism, that was just unheard of until the 1800s. Okay? So look, having looked at the options, I don't think we can actually do better than what Newton thought and his contemporaries. I think the laws really just are God's decrees for how nature must go. And the philosopher Alvin Plantinga calls this type of nomological realism decretalism. The laws just are God's decrees. Now, of course, if you're not a theist, right, this is not an option for you. I understand. I am a theist. Okay? So let me try to make a case for this view, and I'll try to extend it a bit more beyond what the early moderns had in mind. Okay? So one question you might ask, and I have been asked, is decretalism, is it really a type of nomological realism? I mean, if you think like the laws are just God's decrees, God doesn't like create laws. And the laws, so that means the laws don't have like an ontology of their own, like they're not out there governing things. So if you're a decretalist, like in what sense do I believe in the laws of nature? Well, I don't have a great answer to that. Okay, all I can say is that if you take decretalism and you have to put it in one of these camps, it just fits better here than anywhere else. It can't be a Humean law because, again, I think there's more to the story than just law statements. Dispositionalism doesn't even really like the notion of laws. And then there's nomological realism, which takes them seriously. So, like, if you don't think decretalism fits with those first two, maybe it doesn't fit with the third. Maybe it's its own category. Maybe decretalism is a fourth category. I don't care. Okay, put it wherever you want. All right, but I think decretalism is the best view here. Okay, clearly it is a minority position today. But I think it has some strengths. It has some positives. It is, I think, a type of nomological realism that's the best camp of the three. Of the three options, I think that's the best one. It takes the laws of nature seriously. And again, if you're a theist, this is a conservative position for you, right? I mean, a theist already believes in God. You don't have to have some additional ontology to make sense of it. You don't have to believe in dispositions. You don't have to believe in universals. And then third, as I've said, decretalism has history on its side. One of the confusing things about this whole subject is that philosophers and scientists, we've been talking about the laws of nature for about 300 years. So you might think we're all talking about the same thing, but we're just not. Okay, that phrase doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. So when scientists like Newton and his contemporaries, when they talked about laws, again, they were thinking in terms of divine decrees. Now, that doesn't mean we have to believe exactly what they did, but I haven't found a better view. I mean, I came into this whole notion, this whole question, kind of neutral. I really didn't have a horse in this race, okay? But when I wrote my last book, I got to figure out what my view is, and ultimately, I think, yeah, this is the best view. I don't see any that are better, and so I'm kind of happy to adopt the view of laws that launched the scientific revolution. If you got something better, then then tell me what it is. So if that's true, why aren't there more decretalists out there? Why is it such a small minority? Well, look, most philosophers in the West, they're naturalists. Okay, so they believe the only entities that exist are things that the natural sciences can get at. Okay, but look, I do find it interesting. If naturalism is true, why is there this theistic notion, intrinsically theistic notion of laws, why is that? Why do they even use that, right? It seems like, they shouldn't need the notion of laws at all. Naturalism is true. They shouldn't need this theistic notion, which is why some philosophers, it's part of the appeal of dispositionalism, right? Trying to get away from the notion of laws. Humeans will complain against me that we don't have any more epistemic access to God than we do to those, say, Aristotelian essences, right? And that's true, okay? But I have independent reasons for believing in God, okay? And that includes part of the belief in God is that God's a creator. God created physical reality. So I'm not inventing the idea of God to explain the laws of nature, right? I've already got that notion. So decretalism it's a very natural position to adopt if you already believe in a creator God. And in fact, again, I want to turn things around on the Humean. So yes, it's true. Decretalists have a larger ontology. Okay, God's in there, but I can solve problems that the Humean can't. Okay, so for example, the Humeans have a really hard time explaining why, say, we should trust induction. So, for example, the sun comes up every morning, right, all through recorded history. So we infer, we conclude that the sun will come up tomorrow. Okay? Every piece of metal we've tested so far has been a conductor, so we conclude that the next piece of metal we test will also be a conductor. Now, why can you do that? Why can you trust those sorts of inferences? How do we know that the future is going to be like the past? Well, a nomological realist would say it's because these events are law governed, and the laws of nature, they don't change. A Humean can't make any guarantees like that. Okay? The best the Humean can do is say that induction has proven itself over the centuries. We trust it because it has worked. But notice that this is a circular argument. Okay? It says that we can trust induction in the future because induction has already worked in the past, but that just assumes that the future will continue to look like the past, but that's the question, right? That's the issue. To say that induction has worked in the past and so will work in the future, that's an inductive inference. Okay? So it uses induction to justify induction, which begs the question. Okay? How do we know that things won't change tomorrow? Induction only works when nature is stable and uniform. Why I think that's the case? Well, David Hume himself, he knew this was a problem, right? And under his own view, he's like, yeah, this is a problem. And Humeans have been wrestling with it ever since. And that's because, for the Humean, there's nothing more to the laws, again, than the events themselves. There's nothing that keeps nature on course. For a nomological realist, including decretalists about the laws, we don't have this problem. We believe that the laws of nature exist. There are laws, not merely law statements in the textbooks, and part of what the laws do is ensure that nature is stable. Okay? The future will look like the past because the laws are the same. They keep nature on the rails. Okay? But, I mean, you might think, well, could the laws change? Interestingly enough, all the way back to Descartes, Descartes argued no, laws can't change because he's a decretalist. God has decreed the laws and God doesn't change. Okay? There are no new circumstances that would arise that would have God change his mind about the laws of nature. So the decretalist has an answer to the problem of induction. You might not like that answer. Okay, it's fine. Give me a better one. All right. So let's consider then a different question for the decretalist. Another problem here, another question. What exactly is this relation? I mean, God decrees something and then events are regular. So how does that work? Like, how does God's decrees, what's the point of contact, right? How's it work, right? That's a good question, perfectly good question. There's two ways to approach it. And one is just to say, well, look, these types of questions, all these fundamental questions about how things work, they all run out eventually, right? Even in fundamental physics. I mean, can anyone explain, how it is that the Higgs field bestows mass on elementary particles, right? I mean, what's the mechanism, right? What's it look like? Okay? Can anyone say how an exchange of particles binds electrons to a nucleus, right? I kind of doubt it, right? I mean, we've kind of reached the ground floor on these sorts of things. You can't get a mechanism for everything, including what God's governance looks like. There's just no model, no mechanism for how this works. But there's another way you could go. My preferred view is to say, well, look, maybe this notion of governing, maybe that's not the right way to think about the laws, right? And this is where I start to kind of depart from most other nomological realists on this. Let me back up just a little bit. Okay? So one way to understand this whole issue of laws is to answer a question. Okay? What accounts for changes that occur according to fixed regularities? Right? That's our question. What accounts for changes that occur that occur according to fixed regularities? So what we've seen is the Humean says nothing. Nothing accounts for it. It just happens. Things just happen, and there's no guarantee that things will continue to be regular. So problem of induction. Dispositionalists and most nomological realists think there is something that's responsible for change. The dispositionalist thinks it's those dispositions, those causal powers. They're responsible for moving nature around. And most nomological realists think, no, it's the laws of nature. They govern reality. So ultimately, they are responsible for change. But there's another option. Okay? Most philosophers think that matter by itself is inert. It doesn't do anything. So matter can only act if there's something like a disposition or a law that makes it act in some way or other. Okay? But I wonder about that. The Nobel laureate Murray Gell-Mann, he had a different view. He once said that any process that is not forbidden will occur. So in other words, left on its own, matter can behave in all sorts of ways. Okay? It's not inert. It doesn't need to be pushed around to change from one state to another. So what matter needs is to be constrained for events to unfold in a regular way. So let me approach it like this. Nomological realists sometimes think of laws as something like Newtonian forces, right? And one of the first things you learn in physics is how to use vectors to understand forces, and it's just very clear. Forces make things go, okay? But there's a slightly more advanced understanding, at a more advanced level of physics. We realize that the Newtonian picture, it's really hard to apply in a lot of contexts. Even something like just a bead sliding down a wire, that's really hard to deal with in terms of forces alone. But luckily, there's a whole other branch of classical mechanics that deals with this, and they're called Lagrangian mechanics, and that's based on energy and this notion of constraint. And the most important constraints are going to be things like conservation laws, conservation of energy, conservation of momentum. Now, that may not sound revolutionary to you, but a lot of the power of classical mechanics and to some extent quantum mechanics, it has to do with this approach. So if I push a ball off a table, it can bounce, it can roll around, it can do all sorts of things. If I attach a string to the ball, now it's constrained, right? It can't move exactly like it moved before. Now that's a very common approach, very common story in physics. An individual atom out there in space, it can do all sorts of things. It's subject to the laws of quantum mechanics and gravity. That's about it. Okay? But if that same atom is bound in a molecule, well, now there are constraints that are imposed. If that molecule is incorporated into DNA, well, again, still more constraints, and on and on. Okay, so here's my proposal. What if we apply this idea to the laws of nature in general? What if we think of the laws as themselves being primarily constraints? So the laws of nature make it that matter cannot behave in any way whatsoever. The laws ensure that physical systems behave in regular ways. So nature is intrinsically active, like Gell-Mann said, right? Anything can happen, right? Unless it's forbidden. So the forbidding part, that's what I think the laws are. The laws constrain nature to act in regular, sometimes completely predictable ways. And again, this is where I differ from a lot of nomological realists, because they think, no, actually the laws do push things around. They make nature be active. I don't think so. Okay? I don't think that laws make things happen, because laws are not forces, laws are not causes, laws are not responsible for change. When it comes to change, why do things change? I don't really think we need metaphysics for that. Science already answers the question for the most part, and really it's forces and energy, right? They're responsible for moving systems from one state to another. All the laws do is keep force and energy behaving in regular ways. All right, so here's the big picture. Starting from the top, here's my big picture of laws, right? So God is a creator. God brings about the Big Bang. But as part of creation, God decrees the laws of nature. So even before there were such things as atoms or electromagnetic forces, God decrees how it is that they will behave. So like charges must repel each other, okay? And they must repel each other in a particular way, right? There's a law. The strength of gravitational constant, that set all the coupling constants for all the forces and on and on and on. God set the constraints for how natural systems can behave. And those constraints then are what we call the laws of nature. We're discovering what those constraints are. Okay, so unlike, again, other nomological realists, I don't think the laws govern nature, where govern means move things around. I don't think the laws are like forces. I don't think they're like causes. The laws instead limit behavior. Okay. All right. They must behave. Everything must behave in particular ways within particular circumstances. Okay, so that's my view. Okay? You don't have to agree. Some of the best philosophers out there, they're Humeans about laws. Some of the best philosophers out there are dispositionalists about laws. This is one of those topics where there's a lot of disagreement. So if you think that some of those views are better, that's fine. You are allowed to be wrong. So it's a joke. All right, so now you know more about the laws of nature than you ever wanted to know. Okay, 200 years ago, decretalism. Okay, that was the majority view in the West. Now I'm in a relatively small minority, but I would very much like its strengths to be recognized. I would like decretalism to get a seat at the table again. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the view that was in play during the scientific revolution. Okay, insofar as the notion of laws continues to be important in science, I think that decretalism should be taken seriously. All right, so let's move on to the Q&A. And I'll stop this.
All right, okay. So thank you for that presentation. I think because we've run over the 40-minute slot, I think, Enis, would you prefer if we just continue with your segment commentary? Okay, great. Go ahead.
So thank you very much, Jeff. It was a really nice presentation, and I believe very clear and nice summary of the debate about laws of nature in general in philosophy of science. So I will just briefly comment around 10 minutes about the Muslim view about the topic we discussed. So as you may have known, Muslim theologians has been known to oppose Aristotelianism. And basically, actually, they defended mostly Asharite and Maturidi school of thought, which were the orthodox theological schools of thought in Islamic land. They denied essentialism and actually they defended voluntarism. And they had an interesting concept, which actually, in my opinion, is equivalent to laws of nature. So they defended the view called Adetullah, which means habits of God. It is sometimes nowadays called Sunnatullah. So if objects, they don't have essences, then how can we understand the behavior in nature? So this is the question, and actually one of the questions you yourself asked. So the Muslim response was that we can study nature and find the habits of God, basically the regularities in nature, and basically describe nature using these regularities. Rather than searching for causality, causations in nature, and the causal powers, we should actually look at the regularities themselves and try to understand nature in that way. Basically try to find out the habits of God. So this seems to be the habits of God, seems to express the laws of nature. So basically what kind, and they also took the will of God over the nature of God. Especially Escherite school, they believe that God's will is above everything, so we cannot really predict what will God do with pure reason. Then if we cannot predict what God will do with pure reason, then obviously we need to look at the nature and try to find out how God governs the nature and what are his habits. So basically, they had kind of empiricism in understanding their nature. In fact, the early schools of Kalam, they would argue that you cannot talk about God without looking at nature, without making observations and in nature. That's why actually early Kalam books, half of them was like physics, what they call Dakikul Kalam. So the theologians, they would start with physics. They would make, they had actually their own physical theories, which they tried to base on observations and then try to talk about God. So it seems to me what you defended today is in accord with the traditional understanding of how nature works and traditional understanding of laws of nature in Islamic tradition. Of course, it should be renewed, but this was their main idea. So I have some questions to you, and maybe perhaps we can see them as comments. So as a physicist, I really like your view very much. So I like to believe that laws of nature are the fundamental entities, that there is like nomological realism is true. But whenever I read something about biology or I read something about social sciences, I suddenly become confused because dispositionalism seems to be, at least to me, to work better with the social sciences and like biology. At least in biology, we don't have much laws of nature. We have a few, but they are not really widespread. And if we move to the social sciences, in sociology, I don't know any law in sociology, but in psychology, again, we have some very basic laws, but they are again a few. Mostly they explain stuff with dispositions and causality. So the first question I will ask is, what do you think about this issue? Of course, if usually people, as far as I can see, who are nomological realists, they will also prefer reductionism. But I do know that you don't like reductionism, so then it becomes interesting question for you. What do you think about the relation of biology and social sciences with laws of nature? Another question, again, which I want to ask you is, do you think that they both can coexist? So your presentation sounded like we need to choose between dispositions and laws of nature, basically nomological realism. At least it seems to me that we can accept both of them, especially given your definition that laws of nature are constraints. It seems to me it becomes even better to believe that both they are laws of nature and dispositions, because constraints, like when you say constraints, it comes to my mind like we are talking about something like conservation of energy or conservation of momentum. These are really real constraints which we find in physical systems. Like you cannot break the conservation of energy. It constrains the system, but there is a lot of freedom inside it which can change. So when you understand like this, and what is causing this change, perhaps there are some dispositions in the objects which follow these constraints, but they also have some kind of freedom, especially if we're talking about the social sciences. It seems laws of nature places constraints on humans, but there is like a huge, like not huge, but there is some possibilities we can follow, some different options. It seems to me when we take into account this, like we can have a double model in which we have both dispositions and we have laws of nature. I wonder what you think about this. So this is all I want to say. Thank you very much, Shoaib. Thank you very much, Jeff. So the floor is yours.
Perfect. Jeff, do you want to
just one point? I forgot one point to mention. So there's one thing, interesting question, which I'm not expert, but I want to just pose for possible, like for people who are knowledgeable in history of science. One can question whether Muslim theologians had some kind of influence in emergence of voluntarism in West. This is very speculative, but we do know that Ibn Haytham played an important role in emergence of at least played a role. Maybe not important, I'm not really sure, but Ibn Haytham applied these principles perfectly, I believe, in physical systems. And he developed a theory, optical theory, which was based on mathematical principles, like he derived the Snell's laws and others. And his book was very well known in the West at the time of scientific revolution. You can even find some drawings in which people draw Galileo and Haytham at the same cover pages, or some of his work we know that was plagiarized at the time. So I wonder, and this is a question, I don't know the answer, whether this Haytham and some other Muslim theologians had some influence in the West in emergence of voluntarism, because their idea seems to be, at least historically, prior to the works done in the West. Occam is very much like Esharites. His ideas seem very much in accord with Esharites. So I really wonder whether they had any kind of influence on Occam or in general about voluntarism in the West. So this is just an open question again. Maybe there are some experts who want to make some comments. So thank you very much. Sorry for the.
Go ahead, Jeff. I think take it.
Okay, good. Let me start with that last one before I forget. So I don't know about any Muslim influence on the medieval voluntarists like Occam, but I think there is a kind of voluntarism that comes up again in the 17th century with the laws of nature. So you had, again, people like Boyle, people like Newton. They were voluntarists about the laws. They thought that God just chooses the laws. It's a matter strictly of divine choice. But from what I've read from historians of science, it isn't clear that 17th century understanding of voluntarism with early modern science was actually in any way derived from the medieval view. So you really can't, it's hard to connect 17th century voluntarism with Occam or anybody else in the medieval period. So if that's a hard connection to make, it's probably going to be a hard connection to link it also to these possible Muslim influences. So yes, it's possible, but I don't think we have any historical record of it. It does make sense the way you're describing the ideas. This notion of habits of God and a rejection of Aristotelianism. Yeah, that all sounds like it's right in line with the sort of thing that I'm talking about. So possible, but I don't think we have anything written down that would establish a sort of connection here. All right, so let me jump back to your first question. You're exactly right about when it comes to biology and the social sciences. It seems like laws play this huge role in physics. They play a huge role in chemistry, and then they just fall off the table, right? So it comes to biology, and biologists have very few laws. It doesn't seem to be that important of a notion. I completely agree. So what do I want to say? Well, I don't want to impose any sort of kind of imperialism on the disciplines. So even though I think that laws are most fundamental, most important for physics, I certainly don't want to tell the biologists or the social scientists, hey, look, you gotta start doing this stuff in terms of laws, because this is really how reality works. The disciplines and experts in the different disciplines, they use concepts and methodologies that are appropriate to what it is they're studying. To say, I guess the question really is a matter of, because you first have to answer the question, what's the relation of biology, say, to physics or to chemistry? And as you said, these are issues about reduction and emergence. So really, for the most part, when I talk about the laws of nature, and I get questions like this every time, and I just say, I say, I'm not doing that. I'm not, to go and answer your question, I have to first give you, I think, kind of the right answer on emergence and reduction. And that's a whole other thing. I mean, that's a whole other book topic, I think. And so for me, I really don't know. Okay? I don't know why it is, even though I think laws are the more fundamental notion. Why is it that they don't show up? Why does the biologist talk more in terms of causes and systems and mechanisms? And not, I'm not exactly sure, but I want them to use whatever is most useful to them. And to say, again, the relation, I think you really have to say clearly what emergence amounts to. And I don't yet have I'm working on it. Okay? Working hard to try to answer that question. I don't have that yet. So I'm really just trying to say, what's the deal with physics, right? What's the most fundamental issue here? And this is also related to your second question, right? Can then nomological realism and laws and dispositionalism, can they coexist? Can they all just get along? Maybe they can get along in an emergent sense, right? That if you have laws at the fundamental level, you could have, say, dispositions in biology or in the social sciences. So you could have different things going on at different levels. I don't think they can exist at the most fundamental level. I think there is a tension there because one or the other is going to be doing more of the work, right? The dispositionalist says that the laws really are kind of epiphenomenal, to use a fancy philosophical word. They kind of emerge from the laws, but it's really what's doing the work are the dispositions, says the dispositionalist. The nomological realist says, no, that's not right. It really is the laws of nature. Those are most fundamental. So the coexistence question, maybe in terms of levels, maybe in terms of emergence, there's a way for them to coexist. But when you're doing the fundamental metaphysics, you're saying what's really running the show? Why is nature regular? I don't think you can have both laws and dispositions. And you go back to the early modern period in the history of science, I mean, people like Newton and Boyle and their rejection of Aristotelianism, I mean, they understood this perfectly well, right? They understood they're doing something different. They're getting rid of essences and that whole approach in favor of laws. And so I think, yeah, there's really, at the ground floor, there's really only one way you can go. You got to make a choice, one or the other.
Mm-hmm. You finished, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just to add to that conversation, so for the people who want to follow, what Jeff presented, again, this is, me just trying to promote his work and for you guys to kind of dig into this. Chapter number 5, Philosophy of Science and the Laws of Nature, is pretty much your main reference. And you can get into more details what Jeff presented. And just to echo with what Enis was saying about how your worldview ties in with some early Kalam scholars, in my book on Islam and evolution that I just published this year, I actually make because I look at evolution from completely the Ash'ari perspective, but with a modern lens. And I actually make it a point, I quote you directly saying that this is decretalism, exactly as highlighted by Jeffrey Koperski. So you're not the solo voice there anymore. You do have some people who align with your perspective, right? I'm going to, so I don't know who was first, but I'll go by alphabetical order. I think it was Arif Adlar. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Please go ahead. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, it's Arif.
Arif, yeah. Arif.
Yeah. Good evenings, good afternoon. And maybe my question may not be so much related with the topic, but while I find a physician and a philosopher, I want to ask, I was listening the Michio Kaku the other day, and the string theory, I can't say I fully understood, but if I could grasp a little bit, it says that we are living in a hyperspace, our universe in a hyperspace where our universe is expanding in it, right? And there may be another universes, baby universes, and more giant universes. So if string theory is true, our universe is just another bubble. So there is nothing special with our universe and our location within this universe. So I know you are defending the fine-tuning argument, right? And do you think this string theory can abrogate or cancel the teleological argument and cosmological argument? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the cosmological argument in terms of first causes, I don't think they really address that. They just deny it. They just say, no, you can't have an infinite string of causes and the universe can go back on forever. I don't think they really answer any objections to brought up by the cosmological argument. In terms of fine tuning, I do think that a multiverse. So should we explain more about fine tuning first, Shoaib? Should we say something about this?
Yeah, I would say just to define it very briefly. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so So the idea is that it's a kind of design argument, or it could be made into a design argument. The notion of fine-tuning, it's a discovery of physics. This is not itself an argument for the existence of God. It's just that, surprisingly, there are fundamental constants of nature out there that if they changed ever so slightly, life itself would be impossible anywhere in the universe. So we've always known that if you change the laws a little bit, things in the universe would be different. Say if gravity were a little stronger, you probably couldn't have things like giraffes, right? Because it's already hard to pump blood all the way to a giraffe's brain. So we always knew changes in the laws mean changes in the universe. The surprise was very slight changes in the laws mean life is impossible, not just different, impossible anywhere in the universe, not just Earth. And so a number of theists, NSI included, have promote this as a type of design argument for the existence of God. We think this fine-tuning is best explained by theistic design. So the multiverse, then, the idea, including a multiverse that comes up in string theory. The idea is, well, maybe there are lots of universes out there. Ours isn't the only one. And if there are lots of universes and they all have different values for these fine-tuning constants, maybe we just got lucky. Maybe we're the one universe or one of a handful of universes where all the constants are arranged kind of randomly. So life is possible here, but in most of the multiverse, life is impossible. I think in principle, yeah, it could. It's possible that a multiverse could be an alternative explanation to design and theism for fine-tuning. Except there are a number of problems, though, with that route, open problems with thinking that the multiverse is going to do that. One is we don't have empirical evidence for a multiverse yet. And again, if there isn't a multiverse, we're never going to have empirical evidence for it. The bigger thing is that it depends a lot on whether the multiverse can explain fine-tuning. It depends on how a multiverse is manufactured. How do universes come into being? And usually when people bring up the multiverse as an answer to fine-tuning, they're assuming that the universes are all kind of it's a perfectly random distribution, right? All the different values for all the fundamental constants, they're all equally dispersed out there in the multiverse. Well, that's an assumption. You're kind of assuming that something about the way the multiverse is created, and it might not be. If there is a multiverse, and if we can figure out a mechanism for what produces universes, it may be that the multiverse generator is highly disposed to making universes that aren't at all life-friendly. It just kind of depends on the mechanism itself. So the short answer is, the multiverse might explain fine-tuning, but we don't know yet. It might not. It would need a certain type of universe generator that makes the different universes. It would have to be the right kind of thing that doesn't itself have fine-tuning in that mechanism for it to be an answer to fine-tuning. That's a really good question. It deserves another lecture. I'm trying to give you a very short answer to a complicated question, but I think that the short answer is it might, but as far as we know right now, no, it doesn't. Multiverse doesn't have an answer isn't necessarily right now an answer to fine-tuning. You agree with that, Enis? Yeah.
And even if it's abrogates the teleological design argument, still we have the cosmological one, right?
Yeah. So there's still the question. Okay, well, why is there a multiverse rather than nothing? If you want to ask the more in terms of the cosmological argument, what's the grounds for the multiverse? There's still a type of cosmological argument that could be asked. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I got it.
Thank you. Good question.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much, Arf. So the next person to ask questions is Nazif. Go ahead, bro. Your mic.
So hi everybody. Thanks for this nice talks about Jeff and Enis. I would like to add something about the Islamic background. Maybe it would be an answer to Enis' question. So as Enis told, the Asharite especially talk about the idea of sunnatullah. In time, it term became adatullah. The sunnatullah comes first, by the way. That means God's habit or custom of creation. And this idea is associated with divine causality which we call today occasionalism. God creates everything, but in accordance with certain rules, which we call adetullah, divine habit of creation. So within this general framework, they also criticize the Aristotelian essences, etc. These ideas moved to the West through several channels. First, by Ibn Rushd. He wrote the Tahafut at-Tahafut, Incoherence of Incoherence, quoted from Al-Ghazali passage by passage and responded all these passages. In those passages, especially the 17th discussion, Al-Ghazali discusses the critique of natural causality and how he understands divine causality. And this appears in Ibn Rushd's books, Averroes. This book was translated into Hebrew and Latin, and very well known among the scholastics, including Nicholas, Ortakart, and Occam, and other types of critiques of this, or voluntaries, how to say. The second source is Maimonides, Moses Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed, in which there is a chapter where he identifies 12 propositions of the KALAM scholars, the metaphysics of atomism. And he, in the 5th and 10th, or in those kind of propositions, he talks about natural causality, the critique of natural causality, the idea of habit of divine creation, as well as their understanding of modality. So the other source is the scholastics, Aquinas, Francisco Suarez. These are very important scholastics. Suarez was just before the modern period. His books, Metaphysical Disputations, was a textbook, was read by Descartes in La Flèche. Both Aquinas and Suarez talks about the Mutakallimun's metaphysics, their natural critique of natural causality and their ideas. So when we come to the time of Descartes, the modern period, Descartes might have access to these ideas, most probably via the scholastics. But I identified one more source, which is the Orientalist. At the time, the universities in France and Holland began to establish Oriental studies, chairs and departments. Descartes knew one of the important first Oriental scholars, which is Jacob Golius. Jacob Golius is also a mathematician. He went to Ottoman lands and bought many books, including mathematics books, Kalam books, theology books, philosophy books. And he returned back to Holland, Leiden University, and more than 100 books are today, the inventory is, we know the inventory, more than 100 books. The rest are sold and forgotten, but at least we know these books. So he might be a source of Ibn Haysam's ideas, as well as some theologians' ideas. Descartes has interaction with him. He received lessons, lectures 1 year, and then writings are coming and going back. But after Descartes, by the way, in Principles of Philosophy, he introduces the idea of laws of nature, according to most historians at the first time in the history of science. And he explains this concept by referring to God's nature. So God is immutable, and there are certain laws he derives from God's immutability and volitions. And these are the laws of nature. But I argued in my dissertation that Descartes, after the meditations, including the period in which he wrote Principles of Philosophy, he adopted a limited kind of occasionalism. He denied natural causality, but affirmed causality to human beings, and came closer to St. Augustine, which he learned, according to his writings, after meditations, not before. But the system is moving gradually toward occasionalism. And after him, Cordemaux, Göllings, and Malebranche, most important Malebranche, developed Descartes' ideas into a full-fledged occasionalism. There is no natural causality at all. And within that framework, Malebranche introduced two significant concepts: divine volitions in terms of general ones, general divine volitions, and particular divine volitions. So laws of nature fall within the concept of general volitions, But God is not forced to act always under these general volitions. He acts sometimes under particular volitions. So they are combined. And this may be an answer to Enis's worry in terms of the biological social phenomena. So once you adopt, I am coming to the conclusion, once you adopt an omnipotent God within the framework of this kind of understanding, which denies Aristotelian essences, it seems that you end up with occasionalism, a full-fledged occasionalism, and you don't need to ascribe natural causality to any other natural object. It would be superfluous, as Jeff said in the beginning of his talk. So my question is to Jeff, I think the creationism was also introduced in a paper by Plantinga in 2016. He explains or offers occasionalism as the best explanation of laws of nature. Why should we ascribe causality to nature once we introduce the idea of an omnipotent God and his volitions, general volitions, or in additionally particular volitions? Everything would be superfluous, causally speaking. So God is enough to explain everything. What do you think about this, Jeff? Thanks very much, by the way.
Good. Thanks for the historical background too.
By the way, one more point, please. I explained all these historical links in this edited book, Occasionalism Revisited, the 6th chapter, Asherites, Cartesians, and Occasionalism. If you are interested further on this issue, you can see that chapter. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, you're right about Plantinga, and I get the term decretalism from him. I was looking for a name for what this guy thought. Okay, Plantinga is called decretalism. I'll adopt that. And you're right. This is one of the very last things that Plantinga wrote professionally. He embraces occasionalism. Now, yeah, I think that's a more popular view, in Islamic circles. I think overall occasionalism is when occasional, at least. And again, Plantinga holds it. There are other Western philosophers I know who hold this.
Jeff,
also,
do you want to make a distinction in his work? Because he makes a distinction between strong and weak, right? He doesn't adopt strong occasionalism. He adopts only weak occasionalism.
I can't remember how that went, though.
It's just human free will. So he believes that human free will it has to have some kind of autonomy, has to have that independence. So he doesn't adopt full-blown occasionalism like Islamic scholars do.
Okay, it's been a while since I looked at Plantinga and got what he said, but I do recall him making a distinction. You're right. I myself I prefer not to be an occasionalist. If you're a decretalist, I don't think you have to be. I think it's an option, right? I think decretalism certainly lends itself to occasionalism, as Plantinga has argued. I don't think it entails occasionalism, because I think especially when it comes to the laws. So in my own view, which if you have that book that Shoaib held up before, and I go into this in more detail towards the end. In my own view, in God's decreeing the laws, this was something that God did at creation, right? So let me contrast with the good old-fashioned occasionalism, real strong occasionalism, or occasionalism you might see in Malebranche. God is involved in every causal interaction, everything that we take to be a causal interaction. So I click my pen, right? I think it seems like it's my thumb that's clicking the pen, where really, when I want to click the pen, God has to intervene and make that transaction happen, because I don't have any causal powers. Nothing in the universe has any causal powers. God is ultimately responsible for every causal interaction. That's occasionalism. You don't have to hold that view for a decretalist. The decretalist can say, and this is my preferred view of decretalism, that what God does at creation is decree the laws of nature. So all those things about how electrons interact and on and on and on. That's part of what God did at creation itself. And having said what the laws are, having decreed, this is how it's going to be, this is how light's going to behave, this is how electrons are going to behave, and on and on and on. Nature then obeys. Nature behaves accordingly. God doesn't have to step in each and every interaction to keep the laws going. It just is the case. So that's my preferred view, mainly because why do I prefer that over occasionalism? I do address this head on in the last chapter of my book. Partly it's because occasionalism strikes me as a kind of scientific anti-realism. So, like as Enis was saying, in biology, the notion of cause is really important. You have all these causal claims, not laws, but causes, causal interactions in biology and in the social sciences. If occasionalism is right, that then all of those causal claims are strictly speaking false, right? Because it can't be that, say, a particular virus causes, COVID, say, or something like that. God is the only cause. God is the only causal agent. So every causal claim, if I say, my thumb interacts, my thumb is causing the clicking sound, the thumb and the pen are causing the clicking sound, that causal claim, that sentence I just made, is actually false, right? Because I can't do anything, the pen can't do anything. It's got to be God. So I would, as a philosopher of science and a realist in general about science, a scientific realist, I think that occasionalism entails a type of causal anti-realism, scientific anti-realism at the level of biology and above, and that's something else I would like to avoid. But again, I do understand the attraction of occasionalism as you explained.
Enis, you wanted to add something?
Yes, like your comment, I think is partially true for Escherite. Actually, Maturidism would be what you call weak occasionalism. I would say Nazif is better expert, but I think human actions are not, at least human intentions are not determined by God. So they are not created by God. Nazif may correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, just 1 minute. I would like to get 1 minute. Shoaib.
Go ahead.
So I think occasionalism is not very well known even today among the scholars, because occasionalism makes a distinction between types of causes, even though occasionalism denies efficient causality to finite beings. Occasionalism does not consider them insignificant in terms of our explanations of what is going on in the world. There are different types of causes, different levels of causality. When we talk about natural events, occasionalists introduce the concept of occasional causes. What is an occasional cause? Fire, when fire comes together with cotton is burned, right? This is what we usually see. Not when water comes with cotton. You need to make the distinction in order to make a scientific explanation. So we specify fire as the cause of the burning, not the water. We have to do that. But this cause is occasional cause, not real efficient cause. It is on the occasion of fire, God creates the burning of cotton, not on the occasion of water. You don't have to ascribe real efficient causality in order to make this distinction. It is just the condition under which, the specific condition under which God executes his power. If we consider God's creation just a word without any real content, it doesn't really explain anything in the world in the first second, the Big Bang. I mean, what is the difference between the Big Bang moment and the rest of the moment? You need to explain the coming into being with a real efficient cause, and this is called God's power. Here, in the first moment, in the second, and the rest. But this is a different level. Once we come into the world to explain the order, we now consider occasional causes or the free volitions of human beings, under those conditions, God creates certain things. There are distinctions, and occasionalism is fully compatible with explaining the nature in terms of the needs of scientific activity. And by the way, the Maturidids, most of them, the mainstream Maturidids, do not ascribe efficient causality to human will. This is the Mutazilit position. They consider human will autonomous, free, but human will is a different ontological category. It doesn't, to which causality does not apply. It is not cause, nor can it cause anything. It is a different ontological category, but humans are free. autonomous in their decisions, but they do not have power to execute that decision. It is executed by divine power. So there is such a nuanced distinction here. I don't want to talk about this. It is a huge different topic. Maybe we can divert it. Just one more last point. I think the interaction between once somebody introduced the idea of an omnipotent God and the idea of laws of nature as a very significant ontological element, then there is a need to explain the natural causality and God's power and the role of laws of nature in terms of causality. And so far, there is no, as far as I see, a successful model to explain this link clearly. There are mere conservationists, there are concurrentists, there are conservationists, there are deists, but neither of them give us a clear concept of natural causality. And we come back to the early modern idea. What is the clear concept of natural causality? If you ascribe it to nature, once you accept God's creation, what is the link and interaction between them? There is no clear explanation as I see it. So this is the main basic problem, I think, with ascribing natural causality. Thanks very much, Shoaib, and everybody have a good day and night.
Thank you, Nazif. Jeff, do you want to come back at that or not?
I'm fine. That's fine.
All right, okay. Mohammed, you had a question next?
Yeah, thank you, Shoaib. Of course, Jeffrey and Enis, I really like your presentation and Enis' contribution as well. So I'm just wondering, Jeff, your concern regarding the relation between laws of thought and laws of nature. For instance, when we consider classical mutakallimun, they divided rational judgments into three groups, for instance, necessity, wajib, and possibility, possible, in other words, mumkin, and impossible, mumtani. And these three rational judgments govern everything. Even existence of God is understandable according to these three rational judgments. And also they maintain that the universe refers to what is possible in terms of rational judgment. If we say that the universe, even multiverse, as mutakallimun also maintain that it is possible, but it refers to what is possible. If something is what is possible, it means that there's no unchangeable law, of course, in other words, but also sometimes it turns out very difficult to differentiate between what is natural law, what is rational law. For instance, mutakallimun maintain that one being cannot exist at the same time in the two different places, for instance. It breaks rational law, not only natural law, for instance. So, and how could you relate these two realms? And what do you think about this?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer. Descartes was one of the few who would have given the same answer both to the laws of logic and the laws of nature. He was a voluntarist about both. So ultimately, it's God just deciding. So God could have chosen different laws of nature. God could have chosen different laws of logic. It's completely up to God. And most people, both at the time of Descartes and now, have rejected that. They really don't like the idea that the laws of logic themselves, the most fundamental laws, are something that God, just makes up. And I don't have a strong view about that. I mean, I understand the worry. Right. The worry, there's several, but one is that if the laws of logic, as we understand them, if they are kind of like the laws of nature and they could, there's lots of other ways it could go that God could have chosen. Well, I mean, laws of nature, we can come up, we can brainstorm and think about other laws that could have been, right? So just for example, we think that quantum mechanics is correct and relativity is correct. That means that the universe is not classical. So Newtonian physics is not exactly right. So Newtonian physics is it's a whole another set of laws that could have applied to the universe, but it doesn't. So we can think about other laws of nature. When it comes to the laws of logic, that's really hard, right? It's really hard to come up with different systems of laws of logic. So that's one. And then the worry is, and I think this is the deeper one, that if we say that God is somehow beyond the laws of fundamental logic and God has somehow decided the laws that would apply here in this universe, that's going to make our understanding of God, I mean, God is good, and some people are going to be fine with this. But it's like, what can we really say about God, right? Because we can only understand God through the laws of logic that we have. They don't even apply to God, right? God just chose them. So now God becomes utterly, not just and somehow beyond our ability to grasp the fullness of God. That, almost all theists will agree to that. But it's like, we don't know anything about God because we can only say anything using the laws of logic, yet God is beyond the laws. That's a worry, I think, to a lot of philosophers and theologians, that really we have if God is if voluntarism applies to the laws of logic themselves, then really, God is completely foreign to us. We really can't say anything that's true about God. And so I think that's the worry. And some have gone so far, maybe this is a more Aristotelian way of thinking, I'm not sure, have gone so far to think that the laws of logic, the most fundamental laws of logic are part of God's own nature, right? So God doesn't decide these things. They just are true of God himself. God can't both exist and not exist, right? God can't be omnipotent and non-omnipotent. It's one or the other. Am I so confident about the laws of logic that I think Descartes, there's no way that Descartes could be right? I understand. I kind of, I don't want to rule that out as a complete impossibility. So I guess I'm kind of agnostic about that. I tend to lean towards no, it's not just something that God could have had completely different laws of logic. I tend to lean against that, but do I want to rule it out? I don't rule it out as flat out an impossibility. I don't want to confidently assert, as some philosophers do, that the laws of logic are part of God's nature. That also seems to be a bit too much. So that's not a great answer to your question. I don't have a firm answer to the question.
Right. Okay. I think just to cap it off, just one question from myself, Jeff. In terms of your view, if you do adopt decretalism, what do you think is the strongest charge against this position? And have you thought of any, counter arguments to this problem?
Well, the Humeans aren't going to like it, right? So anyone who's more of a naturalist, obviously, if you're a naturalist, you can't be a decretalist, right? You have to have God in the ontology. So natural, it's just a non-starter for any naturalist. But again, if you're a theist, then you just have to come to. There's lots of differences we're going to have with the naturalist. You just got to accept that. I do understand that there's also an empirical issue here. I mean, we can't. It's kind of the same charge I leveled at the nomological realists that talked about the laws being relations between universals, right? And there's kind of an epistemic gap there. We can't get at these universals. It's kind of just this abstract idea. So I understand we can't get directly at God. We can't have direct access to God's decrees and even the mechanism, again, of God's decrees and how that works things. Or if occasionalism is right, we can't see those causes down deep. So there's an empirical issue here. And so if that's the worry, that we have to have empirical access to everything that we want to give an answer for, that's probably going to be the weakness. But again, those are also for any theist, right? You're going to have those same sort of charges come up. So I think you do have to rely on inference to the best explanation. What gives you the best explanation for these things overall? And I'm going to lean on that. And if it means that we can't have direct empirical access to everything that I talk about, okay, I can live with that.
Well, there you have it, folks. I think that's about all the questions that we can get for today. Jeff, I want to say thank you so much for your time. I think we all benefited a lot from your presentation and some of the exchanges that we've had. Enis, again, thank you for your comments on Jeff's presentation. And to all the participants who raised some questions, I think it was a fantastic session today. Jeff, you're more than happy to, if people contacted you, if they have any follow-ups that they might want to ask.
Sure, yeah. So my email address is just Koperski, my last name, at svsu.edu. So that's my university, Saginaw Valley State University. You're welcome to send me email. I'm on Twitter, okay? But yeah, if you want to send me questions, yeah, that'd be fine. Happy to respond.
Perfect. Thank you very much, guys. You have a wonderful day. Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world. Hopefully we'll see you again. Until then, bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.